Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in about 30 seconds. Thanks for joining us today. Hi, everyone. Hello, and welcome to NMWA xChange, a spinoff of the award-winning pandemic live stream series, BMA NMWA. Last month, conceptual artist Jamie Porter-Laura discussed her recent artwork that critiques whiteness and confronts the social construction of race in the United States. If you missed it, you can watch it on NMWA's YouTube channel. Subscribe and catch future NMWA xChange episodes. We will share the link in the chat. Each month, hosts from NMWA are joined by special guests to center women creatives. We consider topics relevant to our world and offer insight into collaborations NMWA is fostering while its building is closed for renovation. During this time of change, we are excited to exchange ideas with our guests and viewers. Today's topic is Suzanne Valadon, Rebel with a Cause. Even if you are unfamiliar with Valadon's name and paintings, there is a good possibility you have seen her likeness in artworks around the world. Hi, I'm Addie Gayoso, NMWA's Senior Educator, and for those of you joining us today, welcome. Feel free to add your questions in the chat or the Q&A, and we will do our best to address them today.
Hello, I'm Jenny Treanor. I'm the Associate Curator at the National Museum of Women in the Arts, and I am really excited. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome my colleague, Orin Zahra, Assistant Curator at NMWA today. She's recently completed her PhD in 19th century modernism at Washington University in St. Louis. So congrats, Orin. And we also are welcoming Nancy Ireson of the Barnes Foundation. She's actually the Barnes Foundation's Deputy Director for Collections and Exhibitions and the Gunn Family Chief Curator. Dr. Ireson is a specialist in European art of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and most recently curated the special exhibition Suzanne Valadon, Model, Painter, Rebel, which is on view at the Barnes until January 9th, 2022. Welcome, Orin and Nancy. Wonderful to have you here today.
Hi, Ginny. Hi, Addie. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. Lovely to be here.
So, Orin, we have several of Valadon's works in our collection at the National Museum of Women in the Arts, and I'm showing one of those here, Nude Arranging Her Hair, which is dated around 1916 and is actually in this fantastic exhibition that Nancy has curated. So to kind of get us going today, I'm hoping that you can just tell us quickly kind of who Valadon was, a little bit about her life and her work.
Thank you, Jenny. Valadon was really a prime example, and she is really a quintessential avant-garde woman artist. She's a prime example of an artist who really distinguished herself by gaining success in her lifetime. She successfully worked within a system that has so often tried to suppress women artists, and also by rebelling against the patriarchy in many instances. She disrupted gendered codes, both in her art and in her unconventional lifestyle. If you want to go to the next slide. Yeah, so she was born in 1865 to a single mother and grew up in Montmartre, which is historically and actually still now an art district in northern Paris. Since she was 10 years old, she supported herself working various odd jobs, such as being a waitress, an au pair or a nanny, and a circus performer. And it was when she had an accident falling from a trapeze during her time at the circus that she looked in a new direction, that of the arts. Next slide. So from about 1880 to 1893, she modeled for several of the most important painters of the day, including Pierre-Auguste Renoir, who's an impressionist, and Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, whose work you see here, his portrait of Suzanne Valadon. Although she could not afford formal art classes, Valadon was really influenced by these painters who were around her. She was part of that artist circle. The Impressionist, next slide, please. The Impressionist artist Edgar Degas was also a close friend of hers and mentored her in many of her drawing and etching techniques. And soon enough, she transitioned from an artist model into a successful artist in her own right. She rose to the peak of her fame in the 1920s and had 4 major retrospective exhibitions during her lifetime, which is actually a really important and huge feat and triumph for her as a woman artist. Through her paintings and prints, Valadon transformed the genre of the female nude, and you can go to the next one. Okay, and female nude by providing an insightful expression of women's experiences. And that's where we come here through our conversation with Nancy Ireson, who has curated this wonderful exhibition at the Barnes of Suzanne Valadon. So welcome, Nancy. I think Ginny and I are excited to ask you some questions, have a conversation with you about this incredible artist, about your exhibition, and also take some questions from our audience. So please feel free to include your questions in the chat box below.
Yeah, and I'm bouncing around here a little bit. I'm going to go back one tab up, which is kind of that entry view into the exhibition, I believe. And so, Nancy, just anecdotally, this is kind of embarrassing to admit, but when I started working at NMWA 9 years ago, I had never heard of Suzanne Valadon. But one of her paintings that we have, I was just so struck by, and ever since then, she's really been one of my favorite artists that we have in the collection. And so I'm wondering why this exhibition now on Suzanne Valadon, and why specifically at the Barnes Foundation?
Well, those are really good questions. I mean, I'll be honest too. A Valadon show is something that I've wanted to do for a long time, but it's tricky sometimes with exhibitions. To put on a show of an artist that people aren't familiar with, and I think your experience is not unusual. Most art historians in their training haven't encountered Valadon's work. She wasn't part of these mainstream narratives of the early 20th century. And so, this is probably one of the reasons why it's been hard for an institution to put on an exhibition of her work. One of the great things about the Barnes Foundation is that our permanent collection is so well known and so fabulous that often visitors come to the Barnes to see our permanent collection. So we have a bit more freedom in terms of our exhibition program, thanks to the collection. And if you're not familiar with the Barnes, we're the biggest collection of Renoir anywhere. We have 181 Renoirs, 69 Cézannes, 45 Picassos. So, I mean, really, absolutely the same moment that Valadon was working, and yet not actually including Valadon in the galleries themselves. So this really was a sort of perfect show for us. We also have an exhibition strategy at the Barnes that tries to tell the stories that you don't see in the galleries. So as an institution, we don't acquire. And so we try and take artists that other museums might be buying. If you're a collection that buys art, you try and fill the gaps in your collection. We don't acquire. So one of the things that we try and do with the exhibition program is to round out a vision of the art world during the time that Dr. Barnes was collecting. So as I say, for this reason too, Valadon fits very well into our institutional strategy. But the other question you asked me is why now? And I think it's a really great question, because Valadon's story is so contemporary. If we think of some of the reasons why she might have been sidelined, because she was a woman artist, because she was a single parent, because she lived a lifestyle that even now would probably raise eyebrows. She had a partner who was more than 20 years younger than her. And all of these things socially, I think, did hinder her critical reception. We're now at a place where we understand that different people live their lives in different ways. The sort of issues that she was struggling with, how to manage a career, how to manage a family, all of this is very relatable. And so I think for a lot of us, as we see this exhibition, it will make us think of our own experiences, that, you know, the challenges that we've overcome as individuals. And so I think, you know, for that reason too, it's really timely.
Yeah, I think you've done a really wonderful job kind of illuminating how art of the past can also kind of have an impact on those of us today who are experiencing it, and to create some kind of synergy, right, between the viewer, the visitor, and the artwork. We have another question for you about one of the paintings in our collection, but before we go on to that, I was just struck, you kindly shared the beautiful catalog with us that accompanies this exhibition, and I was struck by the fact that it really seems like the other artists in her milieu, Degas, Merva, and Toulouse-Lautrec, they really accepted her as an artist. And I think one of them, I can't remember which one, said that she's one of us. Is that correct?
It's true that, you know, most of those artists did embrace her, but there are caveats. You know, there are certainly artists who didn't. You know, Puvis Chavannes, who she modelled for, you know, for years, and Renoir himself didn't accept her as an artist. They didn't think that what she was doing was serious. Toulouse-Lautrec, we know, was impressed with her drawings, and he's the one that gives her the nickname Suzanne. Her real name is Marie Clémentine. But she gets the nickname Suzanne after Susanna and the Eldest, the biblical tale of
really?
a young woman who's spied on by older men. So therefore, yeah, I mean, you do sense that she's part of that bohemian community, but we also have to accept that, you know, the late 19th, early 20th century was a very misogynistic time, and also that Valadon uses the distance in time. You know, when she's talking to journalists and critics, it tends to be after these 19th century figures have passed. So she can, in a sense, reclaim those stories. And it's a sensible strategy for her to align herself with this generation that are, you know, by now, by the time she's talking, they're sort of canonized. You know, these are the kind of greats. You know, if you've ever seen that Woody Allen movie, you know, Midnight in Paris, that's we romanticize the past. And I think Valadon, yeah, we can't prove it, but I think she understood the romantic pull of these iconic figures and how seductive it was to think of her as part of that world, even if quite often, you know, their admiration of her was qualified. Degas, I think, is the exception to that rule. You know, Degas, she doesn't ever model for Degas, and you can really see through the correspondence that, you know, Degas writes to Valadon, and he's often saying, you know, come and show me your drawings. He's buying her work, and I think, you know, when you showed that print in your collection, we have a copy of that in our show too. You see her interest in the themes that he's tackling, those sort of quite surprising angles that he chooses in his work, and just that wonderful observation of gesture. You know, that little child who's sort of stretching to tie up her dress, or that, you know, you really feel the weight of the backbone as that woman kind of bends to do the laundry there. It's yeah, she's got a great sense of line, and people did understand that at the time.
What about her relationship with other women artists at the time? I'm always interested in female friendships and the kind of networks that form as they sort of work together within the sort of patriarchal art world. What about her relationships? Did she have close friendships with other avant-garde women artists at the time, or women patrons, or, you know, art critics?
I think the strongest sort of female alliance we see Valadon forging is with Bert Weil, who was a gallerist, quite an unsung hero really, but Bert Weil owned a gallery, gave Modigliani his first show, so really an important figure in avant-garde Paris, and probably bisexual as well. So I think that brings a kind of extra dimension to the story. You know, we often think of, you know, female nudes being produced for male buyers. It's not necessarily the case. I do think we need a more nuanced view of that period. But in terms of being a woman artist, I think it's it's pretty clear that Valadon didn't think of herself as a woman artist. And again, she's not somebody who leaves notes or letters or anything like that, so we can't piece this together. But you know, she talks about herself when she was a child as being, you know, a boy in terms of the way she behaved. Critics tend to notice a masculine style in her art. They talk about her art being virile, and often when they talk about artists in the show, they categorize Valadon with the male artists, you know, to the point where, I'm sort of paraphrasing, but there's one review that I came across that lists the artists you should see in an exhibition, and then, you know, Valadon's included in that list. And then it says, oh, and then there's some women artists that you shouldn't bother seeing. So really, I think she's keen to disassociate herself with, you know, with a women's art world for most of her career. That eases a little bit later on, but again, probably only because by the 30s, there are some more kind of commercial options for women artists. And maybe that's another, that's another sort of route that was available to her. But I think it's not that it's I don't think we should read this as a sort of a sexist gesture in some way. I think it's more a practical thing. You know, at a time when women artists aren't taken seriously, there's little to incentivize yourself to, you know, to incentivize an artist to, you know, to sell themselves as a woman artist. And I do think marketing in that way is an important thing in Valadon's career.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about some of these female experiences that she represents in her artwork. I'm particularly talking about one of the paintings that's in our collection called The Abandoned Doll, which I find to be just such a fascinating insight into this moment of transition, right? This moment of transition from girlhood to womanhood, this moment of self-realization, a sense of sexuality, a sense of self. Can you talk a little bit more about Valadon's sort of unique insights into this aspect of just maturing and growing and transitioning from one stage of phase of your life to another, to the next?
I think that there are sort of a number of ways in which this comes up in Valadon's work. You know, it's certainly a theme that you see from works she produces from around 1909 through to the early 20s. Some of that, I think, comes from an interest in general in the art world in the late 19th century and the early 20th century in puberty. Jay Clark, who works at the Art Institute of Chicago, has done some interesting work on how artists like Munch dealt with puberty in their work around that time frame. And so I don't think we should see it as an exclusively female occupation or preoccupation at that moment. I do think that it is interesting if we bring this into line with Valadon's personal history. And I'm always a bit wary of biographical readings, but I think with Valadon's experience, you know, she starts modeling at 15. And so clearly as a teenager, she is sexualized. And again, we should put this in historical terms. You know, you could get married as a teenager in the early 20th century. You know, you were sexually mature society saw you as sexually mature far faster than it does now. So this isn't necessarily to kind of cause shock, but I think there's clearly an aesthetic interest in changing bodies. I think there's a psychological interest in changing bodies. And if you think in like the late 19th century, it's a moment where, where psychology starts to think of children as beings with thoughts and feelings in a much more profound way than it did in previous generations. The idea of childhood innocence is slowly but surely shattered, and of course by the time you get to Freud, you know, all bets are off. So I think we can see this as a broader societal shift as well as something in Valadon's work, and she captures it so well. You know, I mean, the tension in this painting.
Absolutely. I mean, I just see that doll thrown on the ground. I mean, there is something so psychologically charged about that as she's sort of looking at her own reflection in that mirror. I mean, there's such an interesting kind of, like you said, a kind of tension happening there as she's sort of leaving behind a part of who she once was, kind of realizing somebody that she will be or will become. There is something so, particularly when I see that doll, I think, kind of tossed about on the floor, it feels very kind of heavy in that way.
Absolutely, and I think that sort of that dialogue between the doll and the girl, both with the bows in their hair, one dressed, one undressed.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
I think, also the tension with between the younger woman and the older woman. I do think that is often an ingredient in Valadon's art, this generational shift. And I'm sure that as a model who, one of the motivations, I think, for Valadon finding a career that wasn't modeling is the fact that society is tough on the aging body. By the time Valadon had a child, by the time she was, nearing her 30s, she would have been less desirable to artists as a model. That adolescent sort of brightness would have started to fade, and she must have been conscious of that. And often in her art, you do see older women kind of looking at younger women, and I think that again invites this sort of psychological reading.
The older woman, I mean, she's still very nurturing here. Do you think Valadon is trying to show that sort of the expected transition of a woman into motherhood? I mean, do you think there's any kind of commentary on that, or is it just more to highlight the kind of tension between youth and sort of the aged woman's body?
I don't think the two are mutually exclusive, and I think that's why she feels so contemporary now, because now, like if you look on sort of parenting forums, women are much more open about saying, I want to be this and I want to be a parent, and how do these things align? You do sense that the mothers that appear in Valadon's work are, and actually the children who appear in Valadon's work, these are all independent individuals who somehow impact on each other's worlds. And I think that again is something we don't tend to see so clearly in art of this period. Yes, you absolutely feel that kind of nurturing, the way that the hands are sort of gently drying the child's body, but you wonder also, well, is there some sort of curiosity there? She's looking at the child who's looking at herself. There's this sense of shifting relationships. It's a fascinating work. There's so much to unpack in this painting.
Absolutely. We just have a question about the gallerist that was a friend of Valadon's. Can you repeat the name of the gallery, or the gallerist rather?
Bert Weil, and I will. I always get my I's and my E's muddled up, so I'll just check the spelling, put it in the chat for you.
Okay, great, thank you. If we want to continue the conversation with her representations of the nude, I'm interested in her representations of the Black figure. Can you go to the next slide, Ginny? Sorry, I'm making you jump around all over the place, but this is, my own background. I study a lot of race relations with French artists from this time, and issues of colonialism, and just the sort of larger global consciousness that a lot of these artists may have possessed at this time with the kind of intercultural exchanges and exchanges through empire. How can we position Valadon within these discourses of race and the avant-garde? Her art is very transgressive in many ways, but when it comes to race, do you think that she is sort of forward-looking? Is she a product of her time, or is she something, in the middle, a more complex and ambiguous?
I think the jury's out. And I think that's one of the interesting things that this exhibition could do, is to show this painting that we know Valadon called Black Venus, with another work that she produced of the same model. Just to put this in context also, Valadon in 1919 produces 5 images of the same black model. This one, the Venus Noire, one of a seated black woman, and then 3 which we think Valadon's original titles basically suggested that the figure was enslaved. So even within that question of titling, there's a lot that is being kind of thrown into question. We might sort of think, well, is is, you know, the title Black Venus, trying to take antiquity and broaden our definition of beauty and actually, you know, kind of diversify the past. On the other hand, the idea that this figure might have been an enslaved person clearly reverts back to the racist stereotypes of the time. I think that yeah, one of the things we did in the catalogue is we invited Denise Morel, Adrienne Childs, Lauren Jimison and Ebony Pollock to have a conversation around these issues. You know, these haven't been unpacked in a show before, and there's still a lot more that I think we can do with it. But one of the things that really struck me is that Adrienne Childs said, you know, we can't expect these images on some level not to be racist. Valadon's working at a racist moment. We live in a racist society even now. What we can see is ways in which they are unlike images of Black figures that are made in previous generations. And Denise, you know, was very, you know, very sort of openly pointed out, you know, there aren't ethnic signifiers in terms of the jewelry that this figure is wearing. To actually show a full-length Black woman naked without, you know, without other figures in the scene, without there being some sort of implied narrative, that in itself is an interesting move, which you don't see in 19th century art. So in many ways, you know, there are progressive elements of this, and it's Ebony Pollock in her work, you know, points out that this work is made at the moment, you know, around the moment that the first Pan-African Congress is held in Paris. So it's a moment also where French society is asking itself about equality, and if you look at, you know, even if you look at sort of the ways in which French citizenship is being defined, you know, in terms of you know, if you were born in a then French colony, you were essentially French. That is quite different to how other European countries were looking at the parts of Africa that they were occupying. So it is kind of interesting that these works in many ways sort of speak to these different tensions. But in a sense, with you having worked so much on this, I'd be interested to see how you read it.
Well, I mean, I see different kinds of ideas here. One, I see that she's also looking at Gauguin, Gauguin's figures from Tahiti, which brings another element of, you know, the so-called sort of non-Western woman in these depictions. And that Gauguin in himself is a problematic figure. And so for Valadon to kind of emulate part of what Gauguin was doing kind of brings an interesting dimension there. And in terms of citizenship, I think it is interesting. There were definitely Afro-Caribbean migrants in France at this time, and there were going to be more so in the 20th century, more so in the 20th century than a few decades earlier in the 19th century. So I wonder if Valadon, you know, has been exposed to various Black communities that have been, or the migrant Paris, that migrant presence in Paris at that time. And that's always an interesting aspect of the discussion, which I know Denise Morel works on, is that there was a small but very present community of Black figures in Paris around this time, writers, models, au pairs, you know, nannies. There are people from various classes working through, and it would be really interesting to see, has Valadon come in contact with them, other than this particular model whose name I don't know. Has she been in contact with some of these other emigres from the US, even from America at that time, and would that have affected her art through this, you know, constant sort of exposure with Black figures in her, and Montmartre as well, Paris and Montmartre?
I think that's entirely possible. You know, there's such an interest in Black culture in Paris in the 20s, especially. I think of figures like Josephine Baker.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the sort of the jazz scene. One of the things that remains to be done, and I hope very much somebody will take up the baton with this one, but yeah, prior to the pandemic, one of the things that Denise was very keen to do, and certainly I was too, yeah, was to get into the archives in Paris and to see if we could actually identify this figure. I'm sure that there must be some way of tracking down who she was, but you know, we did the work on this show during the pandemic, which threw us all sorts of curveballs.
It's so difficult to do that archival research.
Yeah, so there was a limit to what we could do. But I mean, Lauren Jimison, who was also part of our conversation, had done her dissertation on Valadon, so was also able to share a few archival bits and pieces that she'd sourced before the restrictions came in. But there's definitely work to do there. I think it would be fascinating if we could work out who this person was.
And very formally, I'm looking at this painting. I mean, she's nude, but compared to some of, representations of the Black woman's body in previous 19th century art, she's not hypersexualized, there's something sort of like slightly muscular about her arms. I mean, there is something that's sort of sincere and endearing about the way she is represented. Doesn't make her kind of like a passive object to be gazed at. Do you think, is that just me because I want to believe in that, or did you see something different in these sorts of depictions?
I mean, it's interesting that you say that. So we know that, Valadon admired Degas, and Degas, one of his models is Miss Lala, the athlete.
Who was very muscular and was all about her like strength. Yeah.
And we know that Degas was very taken with Miss Lala's musculature. And again, if we contextualize that, bodybuilding becomes a thing in the late 19th century. Mm-hmm. The standards around women's bodies change in the early 20th century. So actually, becoming leaner, actually developing muscle tone by the late teens when this painting is made, regardless of ethnicity, it's becoming a moment where women care more about exercise, about not putting on weight, about keeping their bodies hair free. All of the stuff that women deal with now really becomes a thing in the late teens, early 20s.
And much like Valadon herself,
women in Valadon's pictures.
Yeah, and I also think much like Valadon herself, who took on many roles. She was a circus performer, she was a model, and so on. Working class women had all of these sort of roles that they played. They didn't just necessarily stick to one job. So it could also be that this model herself worked in the, was as a performer of some sort, was a circus or something that would cause her to be so sort of fit and muscular looking, could give an insight into who she might have been. If we look at different areas of entertainment that she may have belonged in.
It could be, and even just regular work. It became, if you think of the First World War, the 1914 to 18 war, because men in France tended to be at the fighting. Women were taking those jobs. Women were becoming financially independent. So they actually are becoming more active. And even fashions change. Like Chanel is at that moment, putting people in loose clothing like jersey material. All the kind of corsets are going. So the way in which to actually have structure in your own body rather than in your clothing becomes a thing. It's kind of fascinating how much changes around that time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've been hogging the conversation because this is something I'm so interested in. Ginny, did you have anything to ask about some of the other incredible images in the show?
Well, that's exactly why we asked you on, Orin, because this is your wheelhouse, and it's fascinating to listen to you both discuss it. Certainly know a lot more about this time period than I do. I did really want to touch, since we're talking about nudes, maybe bring up another painting that's in the exhibition that features a nude self-portrait of Valadon, of which she did a few, I think, but this one also includes a male nude. And I'm wondering if we could just talk about this one for a minute, and then we have a few questions from our audience as well. Nancy, I'm wondering, how usual or unusual was it for a woman artist to do a male nude? And I think that we should note here that the strategically placed leaves over Adam's body were not originally put there by Valadon, correct?
That's right. Yes, so Valadon first paints this image of herself and her young lover Andreutta in 1909, and it's full frontal nudity. You know, it's a pretty outrageous thing to have done at that time, and for any artist actually to have, yeah, sort of a double nude portrait that includes themselves is incredibly. I mean, I don't know of another example. Be fascinated to if somebody does know, but it's in that sense it's truly groundbreaking. I think that she does paint the leaves on later to include the piece in an exhibition, but we probably have to temper it a little bit, because although in terms of its personal significance, I think this is huge, you know, to paint yourself and your partner in such an explicitly sexualized way as well. You know, these figures are Adam and Eve, you know, all of this is very charged. But to a general audience who didn't know Valadon, they wouldn't know the personal history around this picture. Again, yeah, there is that sort of that Gauguin reference that you were talking about. We know that Valadon admired Gauguin greatly. So, you know, actually showing these figures in that way with this kind of very, you know, strong outline around them, all of that makes a lot of sense in terms of 19th century art. And even the figures of Adam and Eve, you know, I mean, Valadon, I don't expect this was the first time that Valadon posed as Eve. It's just interesting that on this occasion she's doing it for herself. I think that, you know, for our time, what's interesting is that it's clearly an image that is, you know, it's charged by female desire, and, you know, female desire is still something that society struggles with. You know, the idea that, you know, she often makes drawings or paintings that include her partner, and that desire is clearly there. So I think, you know, it's something to celebrate within, you know, within a show happening in 2021.
A question about the size of some of these works. Does she usually paint in such large sizes? Some of them are almost lifelike sizes, life size rather.
Yeah, I mean, this one is a little shy of that, but it's certainly imposing. Yeah, by and large, the size of Valadon's works are, you know, they're kind of easel painting size. There you've got, yeah, very, very nice segue there. We've got your abandoned doll within the galleries. And again, I suppose, and yeah, here's our exhibition. The painting that you see actually on the left of the installation shot there is another one which Andreutta probably posed for, or at least was the model for, which has the sort of the naked male figure in the clearing looking at the female figures. Yeah, but again, you know, these were designed to be seen in exhibitions like the Salon des Indépendants, which was where, you know, people like all sorts of people, you know, like Sickert and Munch, and you know, I mean, the Indépendants at that time were also having sort of retrospective exhibitions of people like Zahra. Well, that's a little bit earlier, but, you know, it's really the sort of the place where anybody can show work, and really the place that allows so many artists we know about now to get their first shot at having an audience, because you basically paid an entrance fee and you could show your work. And so Valadon was very much part of that, and you can imagine these paintings would have made quite an impact within those displays.
We also have a question kind of going back to Valadon herself and her biography. But she started modeling at the age of 15, and this person was wondering about Valadon's family circumstances. Was she forced to do that out of economic necessity, and what kind of class was her family? What was her background in general?
So Valadon had a really tough upbringing. She was born into a single parent family herself. Probably didn't know her father. So when she was very young, she was born in provincial France. The family moved to Paris, during her childhood. She even spends time being looked after by relations. She sort of drops out of school. She's not an easy child by the sounds of things, if you sort of read between the lines. And she tries her hand at various kind of unskilled jobs, like working on a market stall, maybe being a seamstress for a while, also the semi-skilled kind of labour. Certainly modelling was not something you took on lightly. It would probably ruin your chances of a respectable marriage. It wasn't the sort of thing that nice girls did. So although again, when Valadon talks about it, there's a sort of celebration of it, and I'm sure she was good at it, and there must have been some pleasure to be taken from it. But at the same time, it would have had some drawbacks as well, and it's grueling. Modelling meant sort of standing still for hours on end, probably putting up with the comments or worse from your employers. Sometimes modelling was seen as akin to sex work. It depended on who your employer was. So it was not an easy gig, and it is interesting that it seems as if she tries to develop a relationship with Toulouse-Lautrec that would end up in marriage potentially, and she ends up marrying a businessman. And although again this is not to say that there wasn't affection there, but there would have also been financial incentives to move on your situation. And she has, as a single parent herself, who we don't know who the father of her child was. She would also have the family to care for. She was looking after her son, she was looking after her elderly mother. So really a breadwinner for much of her life.
And another question that just came in kind of along those lines is, did she sell a lot of work during her lifetime? Was it enough to be able to sustain herself and her family? And I think I also read in the catalog that one of the reasons why she turned to oil painting was because she could command higher prices for those than she could for prints and drawings.
This is not something that's documented, but it's certainly my reading on it. I think that when she meets André Jutte, who is a friend of her by now grown-up son, she leaves her middle-class marriage. And that's around the time she starts painting as well. And the sort of the standard narrative in biographies of Valadon is she starts painting for love. And again, this is not to say that she doesn't, but I think it's also interesting that the painting starts at a moment where she is relatively independent financially and needs that income. She does sell work within her career. She's most popular in the early 20s. Bert Weil has a few shows of her work. There's she's not raising incredible prices, but there's a steady income. The thing that brings the most financial security to Valadon is the fact that her son, Maurice Utrillo, becomes a well-known artist in his own right, and in fact his fame far eclipses that of his mother. So for much of Valadon's life, she's also benefiting from the fact that her son is selling his work well. They, as a family, they're not great at money management, so it's still, they have sort of very precarious moments. And when Utrillo marries, then Valadon loses some of that income, so it's a little bit of a roller coaster. But she does have a strong career. She is selling work. She is getting critical recognition. So the state is buying works by Valadon. So it's in a way it's so strange that she's not had more recognition by this point.
And one last question before we wrap it up, and this is just my own question to be complicated. Have there been other exhibitions of her work in the US?
Not museum shows. There've been commercial gallery exhibitions, but to our knowledge, this is the first time Valadon has been shown in yeah, in a major art institution.
Yeah,
So
that's
it's
amazing.
quite wild, really. And our colleagues in Copenhagen, the exhibition will travel to the Glyptotek in Copenhagen in February, and they were saying that yeah, it will be the first time Valadon has been shown in Scandinavia in a museum. Yeah, so often people, even the shows I've seen in France, have tended to show Valadon alongside Utrio, sometimes Ruta, who was also a painter. So to actually single her out and celebrate her as an individual and as an artist in her own right is unusual.
Yeah, well, it looks like an absolutely beautiful exhibition, and I certainly plan on traveling up there as soon as my daughter is fully vaccinated and I can travel again. One of the first places I'm going for sure. Orin and Nancy, thank you so much for joining us today. It was an absolute pleasure to hear from both of you on this really astounding artist who 100% deserves to be much more widely known and kind of discussed in all art history classes moving forward. Again, I just want to remind people that the title of the exhibition is Suzanne Valadon, Model, Painter, Rebel, on view through January 9th, 2020 at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. And Addie, I will turn it over to you to close us out.
Yes, thank you again, Orin and Nancy, for joining us today. Congratulations on the show, Nancy. And thank you all for joining us today and watching our episode of NMWA xChange. Please join us on Tuesday, December 14th for our next episode at 12 noon Eastern. Our topic is Remembering Those Lost, and our special guest is Washington, D.C. area artist and activist Suzanne Brennan Furstenberg. She will discuss her recent In America Remember installation. It blanketed the National Mall with over 700,000 white flags, honoring each person in the U.S. who has died from COVID, while also visualizing the magnitude of our loss as a nation. So we hope you will join us. Please do register at any time before the program, and we look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.